Greetings once more, Tubaneros. Well, as noted serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer or Andre Chikatilo or Ted Bundy would say, it's that time again. The U.S. government is sure saying so as it salivates over Syria. It's been what, all of 2 years now since Washington has tasted fresh blood on any satisfying level as in Libya? Since Hillary Clinton gloated like a cannibal queen over Muammar Gaddafi's lynching? We came, we saw, he died, ha ha ha. Just as it's useful to profile the common run of serial offenders in police work, it's also necessary for us common folk to get into the heads, the mindset of those dealing death and destruction to a new round of victims in our name. Most useful in such regard is this handy little volume put out by the United States Council on Foreign Relations. Humanitarian Intervention, Crafting a Workable Doctrine, with 4 options presented as memoranda to the President by leading former policy analysts of the United States government. Arnold Cantor, Holly J. Burkhalter, Stanley A. McChrystal, and Dov S. Zakheim. It was published in 2000, even before Iraq, right after the humanitarian interventions in the Balkans. But like all true windows into the human psyche, it's timeless. Where to begin is the real problem. I can only present a small fraction of this invaluable work in a tube video. For instance, on page 23. Ms. Burkhalter, then a leading advocate for Physicians for Human Rights, sharing a Nobel Peace Prize, writes, "The United States, which leads in almost every other international endeavor, cannot simply exempt itself when mass murder of unarmed people unfolds." Quite right. And one of the international endeavors in which the U.S. has shown its leadership is the dropping of military ordnance, including chemical weapons, upon unarmed people. How many gooks and Vietnamese rice paddies were napalmed in Agent Orange's enemy combatants to boost the body count ratio will never be known. But you can be certain that these deaths will never be judged as mass murder, nor atrocity by weapon of mass destruction, nor their perpetrators indicted as war criminals fit for docket dates before international tribunals. We won't add the use of depleted uranium in the Balkans right before this book's publication. Whoops, looks like I just did. Those who rule in Washington will, however, most strenuously exempt its allies from the repercussions of mass murder, like Israel's use of white phosphorus in Palestine and Lebanon. But, on page 17, we're reassured by the late Mr. Arnold Cantor, former Undersecretary of State, that the American people will pay the price, both human and monetary, of U.S. intervention if they are convinced it's worth it. As a corollary, we should not consider armed humanitarian intervention in cases in which we would have to face a substantial military opponent. The humanitarian impulse cannot justify committing the United States to a major war. One need look no further than Chechnya. Aside from the fact that the American public has never pushed its government into going to war, what this means is that the moral dimension of humanitarian war is to be based solely on the size of the perpetrator. That is, if it's an easy ass kick for the U.S. But if it's perpetrated by someone who could hurt you back, like Russia and its pounding of Chechnya, then yes. The best thing then is not to get involved, but write pointed demarches before international bodies. And you must, Mr. Cantor adds, have very high confidence of success, and you can have that only with a third or fourth-rate power like Yugoslavia or Syria. You, of course, will also not intervene when, again, it's your friend and ally like Chile or El Salvador that's killing its own people, especially when your military-industrial contractors are making big bucks selling them the hardware to do so. It also means to baristas that in the really big genocides and war crimes, the U.S. would still continue to stand by, like with the Holocaust, for instance. The U.S. would not have intervened to stop Hitler from his mass murder of Jews in Europe if this were the only consideration for war with him, because the armed forces of the Third Reich were not those of some podunk power in the former colonial world. Of course, the U.S. didn't just enter the last great European war for any such humanitarian reason anyway, and one can even make the case that the Holocaust was a byproduct, not a cause of that war. You may also be sure that even though 1941 was a rare example of forcing war upon a strong enemy, the American people did not force its government into doing so for humanitarian motives. But we are told on page 50 by Mr. Dov Zakheim, former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Planning and Resources, I believe we are told this, yet proclaiming and pursuing Such ideals did make this country unique. With the passage of time, we have learned not to give vent to prejudice and violence, to punish those who do, and to protect the targets of violence fueled by prejudice. To counsel careful calculus of interest when deciding upon intervention is not to forswear intervention entirely. We must remain ever vigilant to the threat of genocide. As the world's leading democracy, America cannot stand by if one group of people attempts to exterminate another. Passivity in the face of a genocide would undermine our very sense of who we are as a nation. We could not be, as John Quincy Adams put it, a beacon to the world. Our light would dim. We could not rally others to the cause of a just order among nations. When John Quincy Adams was president, there were 500 known Native American nations in the territory of what is now the United States. Yet for some reason the U.S. could not rally them to its side as the world's beacon for a just order among nations. It must have been due to their cultural inability to absorb democracy and human rights, like with the Muslims today. And they sure can't rally to Washington's side now, as these native North American nations were among the modern world's first and most notorious examples of genocide. Though Mr. Zackheim does warn us later on that there will be cases where the absence of intelligence limit the ability to deal with crimes against humanity, as he so aptly demonstrated here in his example. He goes on to give as an example of non-U.S. intervention the case of Operation Alba, where Italy intervened in neighboring northern Albania to put an end to the destabilizing violence of blood feuding, one of those post-Cold War peace dividends that we used to hear so much about. Remember that load of rhetorical crapola? Italy could be allowed to regionally intervene to stop bloodshed only because it was a NATO member. But when Vietnam intervened in neighboring Cambodia to stop the murderously destabilizing regime of Pol Pot, what did the USA do? It armed Pol Pot's remnants to resist Hanoi's humanitarian intervention. But whoever said being the global beacon of light was an easy job, right? After all, you can't just take the side of a former enemy who stopped your body count game just for the sake of human rights and decency, can you? Being a beacon of light means several refractions in many directions. And we won't go into the scenario of what would have happened if, say, Cuba had intervened in the U.S.-funded civil wars of Central America back in the 80s, if it had flown its Soviet-issue MiGs over San Salvador or Guatemala to bomb those regimes as lessons not to kill their own people, or on Tegucigalpa for harboring nests of Contra-terrorists. The fact is that sovereignty is respected only when you're too big to attack, and that you're free from retribution when you have a global power on your side. For all the nonsense about the rule of law in the international community, the world is still run on a friends and family basis, where the big dogs bark, what we say goes, and who we say goes will go too. We come, we see, they die, ha ha ha. Now, I know there are some of you out there saying, long before now, so what about those deaths Assad's causing in Syria, even if he's not using chemical weapons? You can't be taking his side and saying those are good things to have happened, which are still happening as you sit there in the peace and quiet of that room. No. Once again, we hear the rasping rustle of straw men at work. The morality of great power intervention is based solely on cost-benefit analysis. As with any serial killer, you'll know the choice of victims is always someone weaker, younger, vulnerable, poor, friendless, the little list of those who won't be missed, as the Mikado once sang. Who should care if Gaddafi or Assad or Saddam Hussein are pushed from power? That thousands of people will die in the streets in order to free them from such murderous regimes. It's just one of those unavoidable things that come with no-nonsense moral commitment from on high. Shouldn't they be grateful for the opportunity to die for their country's freedom, to aid the United States in its global mission to be the world's great beacon? If that sounds cold and cynical to you, then you finally appreciate the true nature of great power politicos and their moralizing. Who can that be now on my tube line? Hello. Why, it's Jeffrey Dahmer. Kind of poor taste to be hearing your voice, no puns intended. What do you possibly have to say about saving lives by bombing the bejesus? What? You can identify with the president's dilemma? That you killed for your victim's own good, too. Sorry, Jeff, but that's just a load of self-serving crap. I can't buy it. You wanted to hurt people because it made you feel strong and tough. You got put right where you belong. The real problem is with those who put you in jail for being a violent offender against human rights, when the wrong humans have no rights that they gotta respect.